Okay, so first question, how do you tell if a wheel bearing is bad? Normally you can tell by driving the car. When you drive the car, if you've got a bad wheel bearing, you will hear a roaring type noise. Um, that noise will be different depending on speed, vehicle speed. So when you first start rolling, sometimes you can hear it. As you speed up, the noise will get louder or higher, and not necessarily higher in pitch, but it'll basically get louder the faster you drive. Um, Something I like to do is swerve just a little bit, go out on some back road somewhere where there's no traffic. And if you swerve the car left and right, you'll hear one direction you'll hear the noise get a little louder. The other direction you'll hear the noise get a little bit quieter. Um, those are all classic symptoms of a bad wheel bearing. Now, which wheel bearing it is, sometimes you can tell just by where the noise is coming from. It's I hear it in the left front or I hear it in the right rear or whatever. Um, Another way you can tell, put the car up on jack stands like this, grab the top and the bottom of the wheel, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear this or not, maybe. So I can feel, you can probably see the wheel actually moving, and you can hear that clunking back and forth. So that tells me this wheel bearing is shot. It's loose internally, and that's where the play is coming from. The only other thing, well, there's a couple things that would cause this wheel to move up and down like this. It would not be the wheel bearing. Um, a lower ball joint that's shot, if the lug nuts were loose, um, those things would allow the wheel to move like that without the wheel bearing actually being bad. So the movement coupled with driving it and having that wheel bearing noise I described both tell me it's definitely the wheel bearing. Both front wheels are the same way, same movement, same noises. So we're going to go ahead and replace both front wheel bearings. Okay, so step one, obviously, is get the wheel off. Step 2, 3, 4, and 5, whatever it is, we have to get the brakes off. Normally, I'll just take the bolts out of the caliper bracket, the bolts that hold the bracket to the knuckle. Um, I'll hang that up here out of the way. I've got special brake hanging J hooks that I'll show you here in a minute. But I'll hold that up out of the way. That way it's not hanging from the hose. Take the rotor off. We're going to have to take the tie rod end off. And we're going to have to take these two bolts out that hold the knuckle to the strut. And the reason for that is when we take the nut off the axle shaft, we're going to have to pull the axle shaft out of the bearing or the bearing off of the axle shaft. So let me get all this stuff tore apart and we'll go from there. Squeeze in the brake pads just a little bit, just enough to where the caliper will slide up off of the rotor easy. Sorry, I got to move you guys around. I've got you attached on my cart, which probably ain't the best place to put you because whenever I got to reach for a tool, these are the hooks I was talking about, and you can get them on eBay. They're a real hard steel, so they're good for hanging heavy stuff. They're not going to bend or whatever, like a coat hanger or something would. You can also do it with a zip tie if you're really trying to save money. If you're not a mechanic, here's a tip for you. Or if not a tip, a rule of being a mechanic. Anytime you drop something, it's going to go right into whatever drain pan you've got on the floor. Surprise, surprise. All right, so we got the caliper bracket out of the way. That's hung up where it's not hanging from the brake hose. Take the rotor off, set it to the side. Next, we're going to take the tie rod off. We're going to have to turn this back and forth to get the mounting bolts for the wheel bearing out. And it's a whole lot easier to turn, of course, when the tie rod is off. All right, so now I'm going to take my BFH, just hitting the same spot. All right, so you saw it that time, I hope. But just that vibration pops it right up out of there. So we'll get that out of the way. We have to unplug our ABS here. The new wheel bearings come with new ABS sensors. So the next two things, we have to get the axle nut socket off, or the axle nut off. All right, so once you get the nut loose, you want to make sure that you can push the axle back into the bearing. As I said earlier, it'll slide an inch, inch and a half back and forth without having to unbolt the knuckle. This one I can't push in with my fingers, so I'm going to use the air hammer again. I've got one of these pointed bits that'll go right in the divot on the end of the axle here and push it in. Hopefully the air hammer is going to do good this time and get it pushed back in. As I said earlier, the other side, the tie rod came right apart with the air hammer and the axle moved. So if you watch the end of the axle here, try and get the light a little bit better. If you watch the end of the axle here, you're going to see it go back into the hub. No, you won't. All right, this side is stiff and giving us problems. It didn't move, so what I'm going to do is try and turn the nut around where I can hammer on this flat side. Or, let me see here, maybe I've got another nut that I don't care if I ruin it. Nope, that was too small. Well, the things I told you not to do, because you might flatten the nut out, it looks like we're going to have to do to get this out of here. Just for giggles, let's spray a little penetrating oil back in there. Freeze off super penetrant with freeze shock action. We'll see. I'm going to put the drain pan under here just so I don't have the penetrant running all over the floor. I'm also going to spray down the bearing back here where it comes out of the hub. Maybe that'll do us a little good when we get to that part. What I'm going to do now, put this nut on here like I talked about, get it flush. That way we're not messing up the threads on the axle. The nut's easier to fix than the axle. So in other words, if you mash over the nut, you've got a little bit of work to do to straighten it out, but it's a whole lot easier to straighten that out than it is the threads on the end of the axle. I'm going to vibrate it a little bit more with the air hammer as I go here. Okay, I think it moved a little bit, maybe. Maybe just a little bit. She's stuck. She is stuck for sure. Trying to keep you guys where you can see. there's really no good way to heat these. We may have to try here in a minute. One way to do it would be to take this nut off and get right in here with your torch, because you're trying to heat where the axle goes through this hub. There's no way to get it on the backside. So I'm going to beat on it for another minute, and then we might have to try some heat. Make sure the nut's still flush. Oh, it's stuck. It's not wanting to move. Typically, sometimes you can just push it in with your thumb after you get the nut off. You can just shove on it with your fingers and it'll go in. If that doesn't work, almost always the air hammer does it. But of course, while I'm videoing it, neither one work. So what I'm going to do is get the torch, go back in here and just try and heat. Let me grab the other old wheel bearing so you can see what I'm talking about. This wheel bearing might have been changed in the past. That might be why everything's easier to get off. So the axle shaft goes through these splines right here. So where we're trying to heat is right here where my finger is, around the outside of that. We don't want to get in here, of course, because the axle's sticking through there right now. But we want to try and get around this edge right here, just to swell that up. Any amount we're able to swell it up is going to make it a little bit looser, even if it's only 0.02 of an inch or whatever. But you can see this one was never lubed when it was put together, how rusty it is inside there. I'll show you when I'm putting this one back together. If you use a little bit of penetrating or fluid film, or even penetrating oil, if you hose it down in there, hose down the outside of the axle, and then slide them together, it'll definitely come apart next time. Let me find my torches here and get all set up. Okay, folks, and here we go again. Got the torch out. Today's just one of them days so far. This ain't coming apart. Got to beat on it and beat on it. Get the torches out. I'm tripping over everything in the floor. Got sweat running down my forehead. All right, so I'm not trying to cut anything, so make sure you don't hit the oxygen lever. All I'm trying to do is keep that space that I showed you a minute ago. Now you want to make sure that you've got your nut ready to go back on there. You got your air hammer plugged into the air hose, and all that kind of stuff. That way, as soon as you get this a little bit red, you can start hitting on it. You don't lose any heat while you're trying to find your stuff and get it put together. Of course, I've done none of that. So, my hammer's right there. The air hammer's not plugged in. That's going to be pretty hot to try and get the nut on, so I'm going to hit it with the air hammer here first. Didn't move. So now, oh baby. So now I'm going to put my little guy. That's why I don't need it on this way. So now I'm going to put the nut back on it where I can hammer on it again. Can't get the air hose unplugged off the air hammer, like I said, one of them days. Pretty much flush. All right, we've got it now. We ended up having to bring out the giant sledgehammer. This little guy just wasn't cutting it. But we've got it broke loose now. It moved when I hit it with the hammer. Then I took my air hammer. The sledgehammer is what moved it. Then I took my air hammer, put it in the center like we showed, and shoved her back in there. It's still pretty hot. You can see there, it's really hot. Can't see nothing. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to shut everything down, take a little break while this cools down. Next, we have to get these nuts off of here to have the axle come out, take the 3 bolts out of the wheel bearing that hold it into the knuckle, and then we're going to use a slide hammer on this to pull it out of the knuckle. I haven't put the torch away yet because as hard as everything else is coming apart, I'd imagine that this steel wheel bearing is pretty well stuck inside that aluminum knuckle, so we may have to heat it as well to get the wheel bearing out, but we'll let it cool down, then we'll find out what we got to do. Okay, so now that we got the axle loosened up, the next thing we're going to do is take out these 3 bolts that hold the wheel bearing into the knuckle. So that's these 3 here. You have to get the axle loosened up before you can take them bolts out, because the way the axle is shaped, all right, so pretend the knuckles on here and covering all this up. The way the axle is shaped, you can't get to these bolts until you push the axle back. Once you push it back, there's enough room in here to get a socket on it and get that bolt out. All right, so I'm just going to loosen these up, get them broke loose, and then I can use my little 3/8 drive impact. The snap-on ratchet has some teeth broke off of it in the gear. The snap-on ratchet has some teeth broke off in the little gear assembly, so every once in a while you'll hit that spot where the teeth are gone and it'll slip. Vibrate this axle back again. Got my socket in there a lot better now. This is just, side is just being a pain in the hiney. Get this other ratchet. Some jobs just go like this, you know. Some jobs are, everything you touch is easy. And some jobs like this are just a flat out pain in the butt, right from the word go. But this side, as you can see, Okay. We got that. All three are broke loose now. Okay. So now that they're broke loose, I'm going to attempt to use a 3/8 drive impact wrench to kind of speed up the process. I've got a socket here somewhere under my feet, going along with everything's being difficult today. So that's all there is to the bolt that holds it in there. Nothing special. Okay, now see if I can sneak this in. Lord, no. I need a longer extension. All right. All right. All three bolts are out. Axle's loose. So we're ready to start pulling this wheel bearing out of here. Like I said a minute ago, or I've said multiple times now, I am fairly confident that this is going to be a pain in the hind end just because of how everything else has went. So to get this out of here, you need a slide hammer. Luckily, I have a slide hammer that has a 10-pound weight on it. The initial one I bought only had a 5-pound weight, and it just wasn't very much fun. Holy smokes, it actually came out without a whole lot of trouble. Well, that's surprising. That's very surprising, but hey, we'll take it. So that's all it was to getting the bearing out of there. Man, I assumed it was going to be so much harder than that just because of how everything on the side is going. Okay, so here's what we're working with, and I know I did it a little bit differently than I said I was going to at the beginning of the video, and it actually worked out for us. The reason I left the top of this together is I assumed we were really going to have to hammer on that to get it out of the knuckle. So I wanted the knuckle being held really solid while I hammered on it. It worked out though because we didn't have to take the axle all the way out. So that's that. Now the next thing we need to clean up inside. So now the next thing we need to clean up inside of the knuckle here so the new bearing will slide in nice and easy. We also want to clean this face off to get rid of any corrosion or whatever junk that's on it, just like right there, so that the new bearing will sit in there nice and flush. We don't want to sand on the axle any, of course, but we do want to clean this up. I'm going to get in here or bring the tool over here. So I've got this guy that I'm going to get in here and sand with. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to get in here. I've got a sanding drum on just a cordless drill. I'm going to get in here and sand inside of this. It's best if you can kind of hold the axle back out of the way while you're doing it. What you see there is not, this isn't metal shavings, it's just dust from the aluminum and from the sanding cartridge. Like I said earlier, this is going to be a day, and this is one of them jobs where you need 4 hands. All right. Find it some brake cleaner. Hose this guy down. And we also have to clean off the face of it here, like I said. So I'm just using a flat sanding disc with some, I don't know, whatever sandpaper was on it. It's not very gritty, especially anymore, but I'm just using it to sand the face of this flat, or at least to get the corrosion off of it. The flatter you get it, or the cleaner you get it, I should say, not flat, but the cleaner you get it, the easier it'll come apart if you ever have to do this again. Probably won't, you know, because the car's lasted 20 years on these wheel bearings already, and another 20 years, or even another 10 years, 15 years, it's going to be getting pretty old, pretty wore out. It's got 188,000 miles on it right now. So, you know, if the new bearings last another 150, you see what I mean? She's getting up there at that point. So that's all there is to that. I'm gonna let the brake clean dry for a minute. I'm gonna spray some fluid film all over everything. It'll help stuff slide together a little bit easier. One other thing that you got to put back together and pay attention to when it comes apart is which way this little shim bracket kind of a thing. Can you guys see anything or not? This little shim deal here goes on it like that, doesn't it? Yeah, goes on just like this. It's sandwiched in between the bearing and the knuckle, and that just gives us a place to mount our ABS wire. So this is dried good now. Take some fluid film. I'm gonna get it all over the inside of the knuckle here where the bearing's gonna slide in. Get it around the splines and the threads on the axle here. I'm even going to take some and spray in here. Now you have to pay attention to which way you're putting the bearing in, right? Because of where this connector's at. So we want it like this. Okay, if I put it in that way, we got problems because the wire's on the bottom now, right? You see anything, or am I hitting away? So we get our connector and our wire started through there. We get our spline started. So slider back. Well, crap. What do we forget to do, folks? We forgot to put the shim on it. At least we figured it out before we got everything bolted back together and then saw the shim laying on the floor. Maybe today's looking up a little bit. All right. So get everything set in there loosely. we want to start our bolts back in it. I'm going to get a little bit of blue Loctite and put on these bolts. Okay, so like I was saying, get everything set in here loosely. One of your bolts it's easy to get to, like this one down here on the front, on the bottom. So you want to get all 3 bolts started before you really tighten any of them down. And the reason for that is you're going to have to wiggle the hub around slightly, or the wheel bearing around slightly, to get everything lined up. The shield and the, bolt holes in the wheel bearing. And if you tighten one down before you get everything started, of course, it's going to kind of lock the wheel bearing into that position. And then you can't wiggle it. So you want to kind of hold the wheel bearing back in where it goes while you're doing this. And I apologize if you can't see anything but the back of my head while that's happening. In the antifreeze on the floor for a 3rd time. And it's got something to do with the fluid on the floor. And I'll tell you why. If you clean it up, you won't drop another tool the rest of the day. Like that. If you clean the junk up off the floor, you'll stop dropping your tool. Strange, but that's the way it goes. Okay, all 3 bolts are in there and snug down. We're going to torque them to spec, and then we're going to come back in, tighten the axle nut down. All right, folks, so we're getting closer. Let's see, off camera, I've gotten the wheel bearing tightened down, the axle nut torqued. Very important, seriously, very important that you torque this nut rather than just crank down on it. If you really crank down on that nut, what happens is it will pull the axle into the back of the bearing and really put some side stress on the bearing. It'll wear out a whole lot faster than it will if you just torque that to the correct spec. So I'm going to put the tie rod in next. Okay, cotter keys back in. Now I need to turn the wheel the other way so that we can put the rotor on and put the brakes back on. So we're getting close to being done on that side. We do still need to replace the sway bar end link. We'll turn that back to the left just a little bit. You don't want it turned all the way to the lock to put the brakes on, because the hose will be stretched kind of to its max, and it'll be hard to get it down over the rotor. All right, so got our brake rotor here. Now, when you change an axle nut, save the old nut, because what you can use it for, put it on there like that, take one of your lug nuts, run it down finger tight through the middle of the nut. But what the nut will do is act like kind of like the wheel, and it'll push the rotor back on square onto the hub, which makes it a whole lot easier to get your brake caliper back over the rotor. I've got the caliper bracket bolts right here ready. Got some Loctite on them. Got my socket that fits it right there. So I'm going to move you guys around to this other side. And put our caliper bracket back on. Make sure you take this hook and put it back on your cart, right? If you left it, if you were able to get the caliper off of it with it hanging up in here and you leave it hanging there, you'll forget about it and it'll be gone. Ask me how I know. So, let's slide the caliper and the bracket back down in here. Get one of our bolts started. Again, just like we talked about on the wheel bearing, it's always a good idea to get all of your bolts started before you start tightening any of them down. And again, like I have to wiggle this right now to get this bolt started in the top. If I tighten the bottom down that's already started, I can't move it to get that top one started. It's not lined up. All right, we'll get the torque wrench out. Make sure those are torqued down. Now that we've got the bracket on there and everything, we can take this lug nut back off, save this old axle nut for next time. I just leave it laying on my cart over here. So we'll get these two torqued down. That's pretty much it as far as the wheel bearing. We still have to replace the sway bar end link on this side, so I'll show you guys how to do that. I'm going to get these torqued down, get everything moved around again where we can see the sway bar end link, and I'll show you how to do that. All right, everybody, this is what a sway bar end link looks like. But they all do the same thing. What they do is they tie the strut, so this is where one of those ends of the sway bar link goes, to into the sway bar down there where that round ball is. So that round ball is part of the old sway bar that's still on here. It broke at that joint. So I need to take that little round ball part off of the sway bar link, and there'll be a hole in it when I'm done. There'll be a bolt hole in the end of the sway bar, just like this one. So that sway bar, the one bolt on it, so this bolt goes in here. That goes in the hole that's going to be on the sway bar. It actually goes down through here, just like that. So that's it for this video, folks. We replaced the wheel bearings and the sway bar end links in this 2004 Pontiac Grand Prix GTP. I think that was the last thing we had to do to this car. We did the tune-up in a previous video, fixed the coolant leak it had from the radiator hose coming off, wheel bearings, sway bar end links. So I think that's everything that we had on the list. I'm going to get it down, take it for a ride, and check everything out before we give it back to my friend, and we should be done. So if you like this video, please click like. Leave some comments if you see something I could have done a lot easier or whatever. Tell me those stories about the days that you've had that don't go quite right when you're working on something. Subscribe to the channel for me, and we'll be back with more content very soon. Thanks, and have a great day.